So you're building a new PC. How do you decide what case you're going to buy?
Hi, I'm Paul, this is Diane, and we are the PC Zombies. And today we are going to show you the tips and tricks on how to pick the perfect case for your PC build. If you pick the right case, your experience as a PC builder will be great and your result will be fantastic.
But if it's wrong, it could be frustrating and possibly expensive.
That's right, it could be. So let's get right into it, okay?
Okay. The first tip is to get the size right.
From the user's perspective, you want to make sure the case is not too big for where you're working. From the builder's perspective, you want to make sure it's big enough internally to hold the components that you need to put in it. Internally, you need to have enough room to fit your motherboard, your graphics card, your fans, your radiator. If you have a cooling system, maybe a custom water loop, you might need a water pump or a reservoir. You need to fit all this in. Motherboards come in specific sizes like ATX, eATX, Micro ATX, Mini ITX. I would always make sure when you're buying it that your motherboard fits specifically in the case you're buying. The next thing is the graphics card. You might have the graphics card sitting on the motherboard sticking out towards the front of the case, which may have the fans and a radiator for your cooling solution. Make sure the internal is big enough for all the components that you need to put into it. Now let's talk about the external sizes of the cases. This is how big it is on your desk or under your desk. The sizes come in full tower, mid tower,
mini tower, and small form factor for small builds.
Yep, that's right. And if you look at each of those sizes, they also correspond to the size of the motherboard. Usually what I do, I measure my old case and I think, what will I accept, bigger or smaller? And then I measure the new case. I get those dimensions from the website and that's what I use. The next tip is about dust. Dust management. What do you think about dust, Di?
Oh, I hate dust.
You hate dust?
Yes, I hate dust.
All right, if you hate dust, first thing of all, never buy an open air case. If it's missing a panel in the front or the side, or no panels, I've seen all of them, then you're gonna get a lot of dust. The next one is through airflow management. And airflow management means make sure that the air coming into the case is more powerful than the air coming out. In other words, more fans on the way in and fewer fans on the exhaust. By doing that, you create a pressure inside the case, which causes the case, if it has any open cracks or holes or whatever else, to blow air out of those holes rather than letting dust work its way into the case. The next thing you do for airflow management is you make sure there are filters on the intakes so that it can catch the dust before it gets into your computer. So now you're only sucking air in on certain places because there's a filter on the other side of those areas. But make sure it exists on your case. Really cheap cases don't have filters. But if it does have the filter, it's a screen that catches the dust on the way in on the intake. The intake is usually on the bottom or the front because the bottom is where the cool air is. You want cool air coming into your case, blow hot air up and out because hot air rises, right?
Right.
And the other intake area is the front of the case because you really don't want to blow exhaust out of the front of the case. The case is sitting on your desk. You don't want it blowing at you or on the floor even blowing at you. Blow it at the wall. Your exhaust will be on the top of the case and the rear of the case.
The next tip is about cable management.
In the last two PCs we built, we had a lot of problems with the cables. We had too many that had, like maybe the cable is too long, we're trying to find a place to fold it up to keep it out of sight, or it has bulky connectors that we have to put somewhere and try to hide. The best cases will have good cable management. What that means is they have channels to get cables from the power supply to any component in your computer, preferably on the back of the case so that the cables aren't in front where everyone has to look at them. In other words, it just appears and hooks up to your motherboard. And you also want to make sure that your case, if it's metal, has grommets, rubber grommets, so that if the cable has to go from the back to the front, it will help protect the cable from rubbing against metal. And you also want to have maybe Velcro ties and stuff built in so it's easy to tie down your cables after you build your PC.
The next tip has a lot of options, aesthetics.
Aesthetics.
Yes.
Well, let's cover some of the easy ones. Of course, when you look for a case, you'll see that you could do it in any color. In fact, Amazon even has a button where when you're shopping, you can pick the color you want. The other thing about aesthetics is the size. They have cases that are shaped like cubes or maybe all funky pentagons and things like that.
Oh, wow.
So when you're looking for a case, obviously you get those choices. All those choices you can make while you're shopping for the case. But there's some aesthetic tips that we can give you that you may want to think about before you buy the case. For example, how do you view the components inside the case, or do you even want to? If it's a utilitarian case for a coworker, you just get a closed case and you build the PC and you don't have to worry about it. But if you do want to see your work on the inside, like you're using RGB and you're doing water cooling, then you want to make sure you have a nice way to view it. For example, the cases we built, the last couple of cases, you could see both the front inside the case and the back where the cable management is. And some cases have glass on the front and a panel on the back to cover up the unsightly cables, and that sometimes looks even better. But another part of viewing the inside of your PC is how do you view it? And I think tempered glass is the best way to do it. If you get plexiglass, it's going to be lighter and cheaper, and it kind of is dull looking. If you get tempered glass, it tends to be reflective a little bit. It looks like money. I love the tempered glass.
And with metal and tempered glass, it looks more contemporary.
You should get a metal case for a couple of other reasons as well. If you get metal, you're going to have better airflow management, especially if it's aluminum. It actually will dissipate some of that hot air just through the case itself. But it also has good airflow from the fans, because the fans could be big holes in metal and it'll still be rigid. Whereas with a plastic case, that starts to really weaken the case. So they tend to have less airflow coming in and out of the cases. Also, the metal cases are great for tougher, heavier builds. For example, if you're using water cooling with radiators and maybe water pumps, you're going to have to attach those all to the case, and the case has to hold that. You want that to be rigid. And that's everything about aesthetics, Di.
What about RGB?
Di's always got RGB on the mind.
It's my favorite.
Some cases actually have built-in RGB, and that's really cool if it's built nicely. If it's just an LED strip, it doesn't mean much. But if it's actually a glowing rod of RGB along the side, that sounds cool. I like that.
When picking a case, are there any tips for graphics cards?
The case might have a vertical graphics card mounting option. It may be a separate thing you have to purchase, or it may be built into the case. But if it does have a vertical graphics card mount, there's a lot of good things about that. First of all, it displays the graphics card, the main fans and everything, so you can see it from the view area of the case instead of just looking at the top of the graphics card. I kind of like that myself. But also there's some technical reasons why that's helpful. Instead of having the graphics card, especially the bigger ones, hanging on that PCIe slot, they want it to sag on one end. And so a lot of them have like options to try to push up and mount and hold that part of the graphics card up. A vertically mounted graphics card doesn't have that. Gravity is actually helping to just hold it down on a PCIe slot that's connected by a ribbon to your real PCIe slot. And it looks better and it's safer for the graphics card. I like that.
Are there tips on power supply?
First of all, do I want to see the power supply? There are a lot of cases that you can see maybe partial power supply through the view window, and from the back you can see all the cables and everything coming out. Sometimes you don't want to see that. Maybe the cables are unsightly. Maybe you didn't buy the fancy cable mod cables that look really neat, and so you don't want to see them. The next part is the cooling of the power supply. That you may not think matters much, but you know, I've seen power supplies mounted at the bottom of the case or the top of the case. At the bottom of the case, the power supply is sucking in cold air from the bottom, and that's a pretty good deal. It's usually got enough ventilation in the back where the cables are for that air to come out without actually generating hot air into the case, which is really awesome. But sometimes there are some cases that actually enclose the power supply, like at the top, even worse. They may or may not have good airflow. Maybe it's just outward airflow, but where is it pulling it in? It's pulling it in from the back of the case. And so you want to be careful that your power supply isn't compartmentalized so much that it's going to overheat. And if it is, you want to make sure you get a platinum or titanium power supply so it generates a lot less heat. And the last power supply tip is, remember, power supplies are either ATX or SFX, but that only defines the width and the height and where the screws are located, so it can be plugged into your case. The actual length of the power supply can vary, and because of that, it may be so long. If you have a compartment in your case, you're trying to fit that power supply in, and you got to take those cables coming out the back, you want to make sure your power supply isn't so long it won't fit in your case.
How about custom water loop?
Okay, there's some tips on that. A couple I've already covered. You want to get a metal case because it's more rigid so it doesn't move the plumbing. You also want a metal case because you want to be able to mount your radiators to it, and you want to have good airflow. But it's also nice, if you look closely, some cases actually have ports at the top and at the bottom of the case, so to put new fluid in at the top and to drain water out at the bottom whenever you want to drain and change the water and clean out the water loop.
Are there hard drive or SSD tips?
You're going to have bays that you could put internal hard drives and internal SSDs, not the MVNOs that are on the motherboard, but the ones that you want to hook up to your SATA ports. And those internal drives give you more data, obviously, than an SSD if it's an internal hard drive. And so just make sure you have the bays that you need for that. That kind of leads into the other tip. The next tip, Di, is don't buy an old case. When you're out looking for the case, it's really easy to find a case that looks perfect for everything, but before you buy it, make sure you check the date it first became available. Because if it's older, you're going to find it has a lot of unused areas and things that may not matter to you, and it might be missing some things that you really do care about. For example, on the front port, you want to have USB-C today. Old cases don't have that, but old cases for sale all over Amazon and everywhere else, because these old cases can still work to build PCs. But when you're done, you're like, oh man, I don't have a USB-C port on the top. That sucks. Newer cases tend to have better cable management because that technology continues to evolve over time. And they also tend to have better dust filtration. They tend to have they're better to handle a big, heavy graphics card that may be too long, because they expect that nowadays.
And also airflow management.
Yes, they have better placement for the fans and the radiators. In fact, the last time I was looking, I noticed some of these new cases, they have, instead of the fans across the front, they're across the side of the front, facing out the back. That gives the front a chance to be a tempered glass as well, so you can see inside the case from two angles now. I like that. And speaking of fans, let's cover the next tip. I have tips on fans. Now, fans, I have a thing about it, because when you buy a case, nowadays you can oftentimes get it with pre-built fans in it. Every time I did it, no matter how hard I tried to get the fan that I knew I wanted, that was already, they said it was in the case, I always end up switching those fans out for something better, something quieter maybe, or something with better RGB, or something with better management software. For example, I don't like having to manage my fans with different software than I have to manage my RGB in other parts of my case. Your case, for example, in your office is still stuck on some really old lighting pattern because they kept upgrading all the management software and everything became incompatible, or you need to go back in and reset all those settings and profiles. It's too much work. After you build the computer, you want it to just work and look good for 4 or 5 years. You don't want it to have to be managed each time.
Right.
So be careful when you're getting a case with pre-built fans, unless you really have low standards or you're really sure you're getting the fan you want. Don't buy it with the built-in fan.
The last tip is about shopping. How do you shop for a case?
Personally, I like really cool looking cases because I live with a designer and she's going to judge it. So,
yes, I will.
And when she's picking her case, I let her pick it. But I give her some of these tips up front, like make sure it's ATX. Go to Amazon and say ATX or SFX case. I always start with the size of the case. That gives you a list. From there, click on color and change the color. You can click on brand and change the brand. Now I like brands, just like I talked about with the fans and the RGB management. If there's any kind of RGB in it, you'll probably want to make sure it's the same as your other components you're buying if you can. And in my case, I like Corsair, I like IQ. I know I'm using it for my power supply and for my fans and for other things. So I tend to look for a Corsair case, or a case that's also one of the brands that I'm also working with. For example, I have an Asus motherboard, which also has a lot of RGB. And the second pop-up I like to use a lot is the materials. That way I can pick a metal case and then I can start to refine my search. If you know the brand you're gonna use, maybe even go to that company's brand website and look for the case. But basically, those are my tips for shopping for a case, Di, and we're done with our tips for buying a case, all right?
All right.
So thanks for watching. Please subscribe.
And give us a thumbs up if you like the video.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.